Okay. Um, Thanks. So as Katie said, I'm Katie Kain. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So a quick overview before I jump in on what the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is. There are some new faces to me here today, which is awesome. So we offer financial and technical assistance for habitat restoration projects on private land. We work across the state. And there are biologists in our office that focus on riparian, wetland restoration, and also aquatic organism passage. So my primary focus is riparian restoration, which is why I'm here today. But just so you know, we've got a bunch of other restoration stuff going on. And our whole mission is to partner with other folks who are doing restoration work on the ground. So we work with federal, state, and lots of local organizations. There are a lot of partners in the room today and some folks who maybe will be partners in the future. So we all work together to put this work on the ground. So planting work. I've been in this position for 9 years now. And like I said, I work across the state. So I have the opportunity to be involved with and see a lot of planting projects as they're happening and down the road as they start to mature. So this is a pretty typical scene, right? We do our work in the early spring and it looks beautiful. It fools me every year. I'm like, this is great. Nothing bad is going to happen. Everything's fine. And then you come back 2 months later and where are your trees? This is actually a photo from the same site that I just showed you. This was a really big bummer to say the least. We weren't expecting the vines to come in like this and our trees literally got swallowed. They're in these pictures, they're almost impossible to see. So I'm gonna try not to be a huge downer, but I'm gonna kind of buzz through some of the common issues that we see in these projects across the state and then talk about some of the planning we do with those problems in mind. So in other vegetative composition, reed canary grass. Down south where there's a lot of riparian restoration work, they call this the green death. It's kind of amazing to think that grass could kill trees, but this grass can. It's really, really competitive, takes up a lot of resources, takes up a lot of space, and it will smother the trees that we plant out in these projects unless you come back and do something. Transplant shock and drought stress, really common issues that we see. You've planted this beautiful 3 to 4 foot tall seedling, and then you come back and it's gone. And you dig around in the grass and it's sprouting back from the roots, which is great. But now you basically have a 6-inch tall seedling that's got to contend with all of the grass and vines or whatever else is on the site and get going from there. Deer browse, unfortunately, over the last couple of years has become more and more of an issue on our projects. The deer populations seem to be increasing and some of the species that we really love to plant in our projects, deer also really love to eat. So this silver maple here, unless something changes with the deer population, the odds are it might not grow out of that tube. It's alive, it's in there, but it's just getting nipped by the deer time after time. Likewise, vole and beaver browse. Vole browse can be really tricky. You come back to a project and you see your trees just don't look great and you can't figure out why. And then you go dig around in the grass at the base of the tree and the voles are coming in and girdling the bark off the trees. We work in a lot of really great vole habitat, these grassy areas, and they want it to stay that way. They don't want it to come into trees where predators are going to perch and impact their habitat. So a lot of these places that we work, I think are really, really challenging to restore some of these kind of fallow areas that have been sitting for a little bit. There's a lot of factors that keep them from transitioning to trees. Flood and ice damage, obviously riparian restoration, you're working in a floodplain. Some floodplains are more active than others. So being aware of if you get a bunch of debris flow across the site, and likewise, if you get a bunch of ice damage, like in this photo, the mature trees can handle that. But if you've just planted a seedling in there a couple months before, the odds are it's not going to fare very well. So those are a lot of factors that are to some degree out of our control with these projects, but we like to focus on what we can control here. So trying to gather as much information as you can before you get to the planting stage. So when you're out for a site visit, be on the lookout for signs of wildlife browse. Are you seeing trees that are getting nipped by deer? Are you seeing beaver dams? Are you seeing beaver browse? Stuff like that. It's great to try to see the site during the growing season before planting so that you can get a sense of what sort of vegetation is there on the site. And, you know, if you're coming in, if it's a crop field or something that's an active agriculture, it can be hard to tell. But if you try to look for the field edges and see, are there a bunch of vines coming in there? Is it reed canary? Is it goldenrod? And then take note of the native woody species that are in the immediate area that are doing well, because that'll give you some indication of what will grow well on the site and some species you might want to include in your planting plan. And then ask the landowner, if they're not on the site with you, give them a call afterwards. You know, get a sense of, do you see deer down here? How often does this flood? How much water comes across the site? Do you get a bunch of debris? Do you get ice damage? Is your soil droughty? Take all of that information and then try to make a plan for your follow-up monitoring and maintenance. One of the big things we can control is species selection. So this is just an example. Both these photos are from the same site taken on the same day, 5 years after planting. So on the left, there's a dogwood that is now smaller than it was when it was planted. Unfortunately, we found out after planting, the deer pressure is really heavy on this site. And so that dogwood has just gotten nipped year after year. 5 years old, it's a foot tall. Whereas the tamarack on the right has fared much better under the deer pressure, has grown a bunch, and it's now at the size where it can actually start to set seed and reproduce on its own on the site, which is obviously the goal of these projects, to get them to be self-sustaining. So a tool that I like to use to help to start the species selection process is this Vermont Forestry technical note that NRCS put together. So this is an Excel document. I'll share this with Katie and Lauren afterwards for them to include in their resources if you haven't seen it. There's a bunch of different variables in this spreadsheet, and you can start to filter out your species based off of what you're looking for. So we know these restoration settings were generally out in the open, it's really sunny. So any of our species that prefer shade, that also tend to be slow growers, we're gonna wanna cut those off the list. So you can start to filter through those sorts of species. Focus on what we call our early successional species, the ones that really like to be out in the sun, they're gonna grow really quick and be able to start to establish some structure on your site. You also can tick through species that are more drought tolerant, flood tolerant. If you know you have beaver, the ability for the species to resprout, hardiness zone, ice and wind damage, all sorts of really helpful information. And then we kind of take that information and we filter it even further down based off of the background information that we've seen on sites across the state. So we've been fortunate that we had a 5 to 10 year monitoring project that went and looked at a bunch of planting projects across the state. We followed the individual stems that were planted and tracked their survival and growth. And we got a bunch of really helpful information about which species are doing best in restoration settings and which ones are just struggling. And maybe we don't want to include as many of those moving forward. And this, if you're looking close at this graph, this isn't the end all be all. We could only look at the species that were planted in projects 10 years ago, 10 plus years ago now. So some of the species we've seen doing really well, like I showed that picture of tamarack, those weren't so much a component of these projects several years ago. So they weren't included in the monitoring because they weren't there. But what this has told us is that early successional species are really, really what do the best in these projects, and that we should focus on those and count on the later successional species, the climax species that we really want. Those are going to come in down the road as the site starts to establish. And then we've further refined our list down based off of, you know, seeing the red osier dogwood that gets hammered year after year, things like that. The species that are really tasted at deer, if we know we have a really active deer site, planning ahead for that and really putting our strongest species forward. So as an example, this is a 4-acre planting project that had been planted before. The first time around, we started with a really beautiful, diverse mix of floodplain species. It was going to be great. We were like, perfect. Nothing lived. The deer pressure on this site has been just insane, probably one of the worst ones that we've seen. And literally everything that we planted was gone by the next year. So we took those observations, we learned from them, and we came back to this planting, and there's only 4 species that got planted the second time around, because we felt like we just needed to make sure we got something established, we got some structure so that the site could start to transition on its own. You're getting shade on the vegetation, you're getting birds coming in, perching in the trees, and they're going to drop seeds, and then the site will start to become what we want it to. But if we can't ever get our trees to live, that's not going to happen, at least not on the scale that we're trying to work. So you get all your species, you have this beautiful species list. Of course, you could get them all from the nursery. That's a whole separate issue that I'm not going to get into. That's probably hours of conversation. But then when you have your trees, I think it's easy to overlook this, making sure that you're really nice to these stems, because we're asking a lot of them. They get thrown out on these sites, and then often we just walk away. And transplant shock is a really big issue. So making sure you're timing your delivery of the stems with planting as close as possible. So you're limiting the time that they're sitting in a garage or in a shed or a basement, limiting the time that the material's on site. Again, this is normally early spring, right? So there aren't leaves on the trees. So you don't have a lot of natural shade. It's hard to see, but the top right photo, that's stems that are ready to get planted and they're under a shade tarp while they're sitting there for the day. Making sure you keep your roots moist. Again, dry roots, it's just another opportunity for more stress and transplant shock down the road. One of the things we really like to do is stage material out in buckets right before they get planted. So you load up 5 or 10 stems and they're sitting in a bucket of water. Before they go in the ground, you just carry that around with you across the site. It just gives them one last chance to absorb some water and kind of get those roots ready to go. After planting, maintenance is really, really important part of successful plantings. And it's challenging for everybody to fit it in. There's often a gap in funding. So I know it's not always possible. Often I'll pick like my 5 worst sites that I know are really going to need the help and try to put the energy into those. But anything is better than nothing. If you know you have vines, even if you can just go once and just pull some vines off of the trees, that'll go a long way. We use manual and chemical methods for this. So in this photo, you can see we're applying a targeted application of herbicide right around the stems, just to push back the vegetation and give the trees some breathing room as they get established. It's not going to get rid of everything bad that's there, but it's just buying them some time so they can get over that transplant shock, start to grow and get some height, and then the next season they're ready to go. For manual methods, that's string trimming around the planted stem. Again, trying to come and do that multiple times throughout the year to push the vegetation back. Or if you have a viney site like this one on the right, just hand clearing, just pulling the vines off helps so much. And then site prep before planting. This is something that we're starting to do more and more when we can. It can be a hard thing, just timeline logistically to plan into your projects. But the growing season before, if you can do something to prepare the planting site, to knock back the vegetation, it goes a long way. It'll reduce that competition the first year around your stems. And it also sets the stage if you can create some bare soil conditions and you have mature trees nearby, or if you can add seed to the site, that you might get a lot of natural regeneration. Whereas, if a seed drops down onto somebody's lawn or the hayfield or a pasture, it's probably not gonna germinate because it can't get through to the soil. But if you have bare soil and the seed can come into contact with that, it's giving it an opportunity at least to get some more trees establishing on the site. This is something that's kind of still in trial phase. We've been trying out a bunch of different methods, both manual and chemical, combination of manual and chemical. So it's not for everywhere, but it might be a really easy fit if you're working with a farmer or a landowner who has equipment, to build that in, see if they can do some of that work for you. And finally, that was, I feel like, kind of a lot of challenging stuff, but I think it's important to remember trees take a long time to grow, no matter what. It's not going to be an instant forest, and it may not turn out perfect, but these projects really do make a difference, especially from a wildlife perspective. So many projects that I go to, as soon as the trees are planted the season after, you see that birds have come in and they've been making nests in there. We see a lot of pollinator benefit from taking this land out of production. So be patient, don't lose hope, and just know that this really does make a positive change on the landscape. We're just, it takes a long time for the trees to get there.